You co-wrote a book many years ago called Who Killed Homer, and then co-edited an anthology of essays called Bonfire of the Humanities about the factors contributing to the fading presence of classical studies in academia, as well as the field's significance. And the reason that I think this is important to discuss at the outset is you've written that classical antiquity is at the heart of Western civilization. And so I'm anticipating a connection between the dying classics and the dying citizen, and that the sorts of things we can learn from the classics might then buttress citizenship in the sense in which you use the term. So, just what has happened to the classics, and what is the field's continued relevance for your present minded thought? And I mean this beyond the sense in which you mentioned earlier that you were called upon for sort of military advice.
Well, in very briefly, and John Heath and I were worried about the status of classics, not just the death of the field per se, but the lack of classical learning and its role in civics or civic education, or to give the undergraduate or even the citizen at large some sense of the continuity of his or her institution. So they should understand there was a long history of constitutional government that started in Greece, or personal freedom, or the notion of private property, or empiricism, or the ability to look at the natural world without religious exegesis necessarily. And most of our main characteristics of the American democratic experience have some elements, and indeed all of them, can be traced back. And then we more controversially said that there was not comparable systems in other societies, nor before the classical Greeks. We didn't mean that ethnically, because the Mycenaeans obviously were Greeks, and they didn't have this system. We know that they were a palatial pyramidal society. Their language was linear being. Greek language, but a different script, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had forecast that, and then from that point that this discipline was essential in the schools, and we had all grown up with it, maybe not explicitly, but we were told democracy, this is the House, this is the Senate, this is the executive branch, these are the checks and balances. All that goes back to Aristotle's Politics, or discussions of the Spartan Constitution, or the checks and balances of the Cretan Constitution, or the critiques in antiquity of direct democracy in Athens. But we were losing that, and that would have an effect on the population in general, but more importantly, it would lead to relativism, or that people would look around at the United States and they would have certain grievances or criticisms of the system without a context of what there was elsewhere, or what there was before, or what there could be after. And I guess that would be summed up as either you don't have to be good, you don't have to be perfect to be good, or you tell me an alternative that's better. Those types of practical questions. One of the things that was kind of disturbing, we predicted in that book that if philologists continue to be so narrow and esoteric and not connected with the larger society, that they would be poor advocates for their continuance and they would be eliminated. Nobody took that seriously at the time, but now we know that major departments such as Princeton have dropped the Greek requirement. And when you drop the Greek requirement, that's a euphemism for not needing classical scholars that know the language. And it's spreading. Howard University just dropped their classics department. That was renowned because the African-American classicist Frank Snowden, who wrote a book, Blacks in Antiquity, he was a landmark classicist. And when I was at Stanford, probably the most accomplished Latinist was Gregson Davis, an African-American. And so there had been a strong tradition that classics had been very valuable. And that was the premise on which I taught at Cal State Fresno for minority students. But we were very worried that classics was not, as generally thought, just the study of Greek and Latin, or 5,000 classics professors, or 8,000 or 9,000 majors. Those seem enormous numbers now, but 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, that's what it was, and it was dying. And we thought there would be repercussions on the society at large. And I had no idea, to be frank, that the woke revolution or the anti-Western civilization movement or the anti-civics idea or the foundational date of the United States or the iconoclasm and attacks on classical architecture or sculpture. We didn't think it would ever get that bad, but it did. And it was very interesting to work with John Heath because he had a natural sense of humor. I was a little bit more serious in a sense of dull, but he had another life as well. He wrote operas for children, and he was very successful at it. And some of the titles of his books of his operas and musicals are very well known K through 12. So there's a lot of funny things in there in that book that I thought was pretty good.